Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who are joining for the first time, my name is Steph Kershaw. I'm a research fellow at the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use, and I'm also the project coordinator for the Cracks in the Ice online toolkit. So before we begin our webinar, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay respects to their elders past and present. And I also further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on today and pay respects to their elders past and present. So for those of you who haven't been to a Cracks in the Ice webinar before, this is one in a series of webinars which is focused around methamphetamine or issues related to methamphetamine, which is running as part of the Australian Government Department of Health and Aged Care funded project, Cracks in the Ice. And so if you haven't visited Cracks in the Ice before, I would encourage you to do so. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just wanted to let you all know that you are in listen-only mode, and that means that we can't see or hear you. However, you will notice that you've got a Q&A button on your dashboard, and this is where you can type in any questions that you have during the webinar and send them through to us. And we will then have a question and answer section at the end of our webinar. I'd also like to let you know that we are recording today's session, and we will be making the recording as well as the slides available to you through the Cracks in the Ice website. So it's our very great pleasure to welcome back Jarryd Bartle, who's an Associate Lecturer in Criminology and Justice Studies at RMIT University. Jarryd is a former criminal lawyer and drug policy consultant who specialises in legal issues related to illicit drugs and sexuality, including the limits of consent under the criminal law. And thank you so much for joining us again. We were very
Thanks
pleased.
for inviting me.
We were very pleased to have you back after the highly successful Meth and Sex webinar last year. So we're really looking forward to seeing what today's webinar is. I'm going to hand it all over to you now.
Thank you, Steph. Just bear with me for 2 seconds whilst I get the slides up. So this webinar has kind of come about because of frequent discussions that I've been having with colleagues in the AOD sector and different lawyers and policy people about the use of terms like decriminalisation and legalisation of drugs. And what's come out of these discussions, particularly talking about recent law reforms in the ACT, whether it's the decriminalisation, well, I'll put that in quotes, decriminalisation of most illicit drugs in the ACT, or that kind of home grow cannabis model that was introduced. Really interesting discussions have been had about whether or not this is decriminalisation, whether or not this is legalisation in the case of the homegrown model. And it's had me reflect in particular about our use of those terms. And I think some misunderstandings about the use of those terms and some questions as to whether or not we're talking about the same thing when we're talking about decriminalisation or we're talking about legalisation. So hopefully at the end of this webinar, I'll give you a good understanding of some definitions of decriminalisation and of legalisation, some models that have been instituted overseas, and the implications of that. And I think there's kind of two main implications. One is from an advocacy perspective or a kind of expertise, making submissions to government inquiries and things like that, by being specific about the kind of model of decriminalisation or legalisation that you think would be in the best interests of society, you can make a more pointed suggestion for law reform. The second point is more to do with evidence. So I think most people who are in this webinar would probably say that, decriminalisation of drugs at the very least is an evidence-based policy proposal. But what that actually means depends on what we're talking about. In fact, certain models of decriminalisation are more researched than other models of decriminalisation, and having that nuance, I think, is really important. So just to kind of gauge some initial understanding in the room about terms like decriminalisation and legalisation, I just want to give you 3 scenarios that we're going to do a quick poll on, where people can say whether or not they think this particular model is decriminalisation or legalisation. So how about this scenario? Jurisdiction X changes its laws so that the person found in possession of a small quantity of a drug of dependence, that's a term used in the law, will be served a formal notice by police. This notice requires that's the poll that's going to come up. This notice requires, that's in my way of my slide, but that's all right. It requires somebody to either pay a fine of $160 or to participate in a drug diversion program, usually a kind of a treatment program. Failure to comply with that notice, either by paying the fine or participating in that program, will result in a criminal offence. From your perspective, is this model decriminalisation? If you just want to do a quick vote there.
Yeah, thanks, Jarryd. The votes are coming in. I'll just give it another second. And sorry that the poll jumped over your slide. I wasn't trying to give you additional
That's okay.
Okay, it looks like the votes have stabilized. So yep. I am going to end it and share the results with everyone.
Perfect. So most people, the majority there said no, this isn't decriminalisation from my perspective. Now, some of you might be aware of what I was doing there. That's actually what's in place in the ACT. So the ACT model that was put into place, it's not a situation where you absolutely could never be subject to a criminal offence. There is just an alternative mechanism in place to avoid a criminal penalty, and it involves either paying a fine or participating in a diversion program. Interesting stuff with the ACT and talks about decriminalisation. All the headlines that we saw around Australia called this law reform decriminalisation. Interestingly enough, the ACT police didn't call it decriminalisation. They released a media release. They said, well, we don't consider this decriminalising drugs in the territory. And there are also some other groups who'd say, well, if there is a criminal penalty that could result from the possession or use of drugs, that doesn't count as decriminalisation. Okay, moving a bit more quickly now. Another scenario, Jurisdiction Y changes prosecutorial policy so that no adult will be prosecuted for the possession of small quantities of cannabis for a first offence. Police and prosecutors also agree to tolerate the sale of cannabis in certain locations, provided the practice doesn't cause a nuisance and sellers do not sell to minors. Nevertheless, both possession and sale of cannabis remains a criminal offence on the books. Do we view this as legalisation? If you can vote on that one.
Yeah, great, Jarryd. I've just let the poll out. So select your answer, yes or no.
All right.
Okay, the votes have started to stabilise, so I'll share the results now.
And so most people said no, not legalisation. So that is currently the practice in Amsterdam when it comes to cannabis. So many of you may have pointed that out, have noticed that there's a tolerance policy currently in Amsterdam when it comes to cannabis, which does allow some supply of cannabis within, particular coffee shop environments with, certain provisions in place. But criminal laws remain on the books. And this is really interesting because people often talk about Amsterdam being this kind of very liberal drug area. But the reality is that it hasn't reformed its laws quite in the way that I think a lot of people think. All right, final just little quick one here. Jurisdiction Y changes its laws so that the possession of less than a 10-day supply of a drug is an administrative offence. That means you risk a fine, but there's no criminal record. Police issue citations requiring an alleged offender to speak to an expert panel about their drug use. Failure to attend means that you have to pay a fine. After a conversation with the expert panel, they may either choose to fine you, they could refer you to a alcohol and other drug or social service, or they could choose to do no sanction. Do we think that this is decriminalisation?
And our final poll has just been launched. The votes are coming in quick and fast.
Okay, that's good. All right, what do people think?
Okay, let's end the poll and share.
All right, so majority there said yes, but there was a significant group of people that said no. And I do wonder if people are aware that that is the Portugal model. So Portugal is often put up as the kind of ideal model of drug decriminalisation, and that's how that model works. It's not what I think some people think in their head when they think about decriminalisation, a situation where government agencies or the police don't play a role. They still play quite an active role in the Portugal model. And I think that this distinction is going to be really important when talking about what people talk about in terms of decriminalisation. All right, let's start by moving on to talking about decriminalisation a bit. I'll move quickly through some of these slides. So just a little bit of a note about the status quo currently in Australia. So we are a signatory to a number of international conventions with very interesting histories, if people are aware of the history here, which do obligate us to have certain laws for the control of certain drugs, as well as to introduce sanctions to control production and supply of those certain drugs. Why some drugs are on there and some aren't, very interesting history. I have a piece in the conversation called History Not Harm, something with Dr. Nicole Lee, which goes into some of that unique history if people are interested. Interestingly, though, these international conventions do not obligate Australia as a signatory to criminalise the possession and use of illicit drugs. That is not necessary as part of that international convention. Many people would be aware that we have current laws that are both a federal, state and territory level, criminalising the import, export, manufacture, cultivation, supply and possession of certain illicit drugs. It's only a small category of drugs that get this separate regime. Other drugs that might be misused in some way fall under kind of more therapeutic regimes and not key criminal laws, because particular drugs have been selected out as being at risk of addiction or social harm. An important thing as well is in terms of possession offences and how they can relate to things like supply or trafficking offences. There is this doctrine of deemed supply under most criminal laws in Australia, which means if you're possessing over a certain quantity, there is a presumption that you are possessing in order to traffic or supply that to another, and you have to rebut that. So our current laws are kind of have criminalized possession, but also can deem possession as supply in certain circumstances. What do we mean by decriminalisation? Well, there are many definitions. In fact, a kind of universal definition has been, people have tried to put out universal definitions, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of agreement as to what counts as drug decriminalisation. The International Drug Policy Consortium focuses on the removal of criminal penalties as being a key part of that definition. And they talk about criminal penalties attached to use, possession, of both drugs and equipment, as well as the cultivation of drugs, so home grow type cannabis. The European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction has a much more extensive definition. I won't read all of that out, but important to note that in their definition of decriminalisation, they do note that decriminalisation doesn't mean you can't have administrative sanctions, such as a fine, suspension of certain licenses, or a formal warning. All right, so many of you may have heard of this division of drug decriminalisation. It's often talked about as being the be-all, end-all of how we talk about decriminalisation. So there is a distinction made between de facto decriminalisation or decriminalisation in practice, where the laws remain on the books, so criminal offences remain on the books, but there's been a change in kind of prosecutorial or police guidelines or policies which mean that the laws aren't enforced. And so there's kind of an, in practice, decrease in criminal penalties. This is in contrast with de jure or de jure, not de jure, as I hear some people say, which is a decriminalisation by law or by right. So that means that the law itself has been changed so that criminal penalties do not apply, usually if certain conditions are met. And that can be changed either by legislative reform, or it can be because of a court decision, which has been the case in certain countries. So de facto decriminalisation models, I'm not going to go through them in too much detail, but it includes Amsterdam, which we talked about earlier, in that they have prosecutorial guidelines which restrict the enforcement of laws in relation to cannabis and other soft drugs is how they define it. We also have police drug diversion schemes, so that first-time drug offenders will be, if police choose to use their discretion in that way, will often be given a caution or a warning. So cannabis cautioning schemes exist in all states and territories, and they're probably the best Australian example of that police drug diversion. In terms of de jure decriminalisation models, much more rarer than de facto models internationally. I've got there around 22 jurisdictions have implemented some kind of de jure decriminalisation model. You'll see other lists online that will, say up to 30 jurisdictions, and can't really go into some of the contentious issues associated with that. Some countries have, in theory, decriminalized possession and use, but in practice, they're still enforcing them. And so whether or not you include them in your list is often a key factor. As I noted there, decriminalization can either occur by a legislative change, or it can be a court decision has ruled that possession for personal use cannot be a criminal offense, usually on constitutional grounds. Different jurisdictions differ on the basis of the criteria for personal use. So some jurisdictions, like in the ACT, have certain quantities of drugs that they say is a small quantity. Other people talk about, a 10-day supply. Other people leave it purely up to police or prosecutors or courts to decide. So who decides is often a key factor, whether or not if someone fits into a decriminalization regime. Some jurisdictions you have to go before a court before they'll decide that it was a personal quantity for personal use. Importantly, sanctions differ from different jurisdictions, and I'll go over that in a moment, as well as the degree of formal referral to health and social services. So the different types of de jure models that exist overseas, I've classified about 5 different decriminalisation models. I've adapted this from a conference paper from Hughes, which is very helpful. I've broadened it a little bit more. But the 5 main models that I just want to quickly cover are a no sanctions model, where there is basically no consequence as a result of possessing or using illicit drugs, except, of course, potentially having your drugs confiscated. A civil or administrative sanction only approach. So this can mean someone receiving a fine, or a banning order, meaning they can't go in certain locations during a certain time, confiscation of key licenses, or other kind of non-criminal sanctions, but that's it. A modification of that model is what I'm calling a civil and administrative sanction model with a pathway to some sort of health, education, or social services. The way that these models are usually developed is that the default is that you'll receive a fine, but to avoid the fine, you go and get assessed, or go to a particular education program, and you can avoid the fine by participating in those referrals. Some jurisdictions have a mandatory treatment model in certain circumstances. Technically, that is a decriminalisation model in the sense that it is not the criminal law in play. It's more a kind of separate administrative regime designed to protect people from themselves. And then finally, we have the dissuasion body model, which is, of course, famously the Portugal model. So the no sanctions model is exactly what it sounds like. it means that law has been reformed so that there are no penalties attached to personal possession or use of illicit drugs, and that's it. That currently exists in British Columbia in Canada, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And it exists in various ways in Chile, Colombia, and Germany, largely as a result of court decisions, which have basically said that you cannot criminalize personal possession of illicit drugs on constitutional grounds. And a no sanctions model also exists in Canada for jurisdictions which have legalized cannabis, of course. The model in British Columbia, which some people might be aware of, has come into place recently. Basically, British Columbia has gotten an exemption by the federal government from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So for a period from January 2023 until January 2026, adults, it's only adults, are able to possess a certain amount of illicit drugs without criminal penalty, and there's no sanctions attached to that. There are exemptions that exist, being near schools and childcare facilities and things like that, but that is a no sanctions model. A civil or administrative only model exists in the United States in jurisdictions where they have decriminalized cannabis, but they haven't legalized cannabis. Also exists in Luxembourg for cannabis. This exists as well for cannabis in South Australia and the Northern Territory under what are known as cannabis expiation schemes, which you might be aware of, where you basically receive a fine and you have to pay that fine, or else you potentially receive a criminal penalty. It also exists for all drugs of dependence in the Czech Republic. So expiation notice schemes exist, as I said, in South Australia and the Northern Territory. People are issued a fine if they are found in possession of cannabis, and they must pay that fine within a certain date. Failure to pay the fine means that someone is liable then to be charged with a cannabis offence, although it's not mandatory for them to do so. There are some criticisms of this scheme. Obviously, the reality that you could be charged with a criminal offence for non-payment of fine is an issue. It also has major issues in terms of that discretion at the end as to whether or not to charge someone. Lots of evidence to suggest that, in particular, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people tend to find themselves being charged after non-payment of these cannabis expiation notices. And so, there's a major inequality in how that's approached. A civil and administrative sanctions model with a kind of referral mechanism is exactly what I was talking about before. You have to pay the fine, but to avoid the fine, here is, this formal referral that we want you to do. This model exists in Estonia and Italy, and it works in the ACT. It operates in the ACT, which I described earlier. And at this moment, it exists in Oregon in the United States, but it's looking like it will no longer exist in Oregon by the end of this month. So just a quick note on the state of things in Oregon. They implemented this fine type regime for most illicit drugs, a small quantity of them, and you can avoid the fine by contacting a health screening service over the phone. The idea with that is that would be an initial intake and assessment, which would then result in further referrals to treatment. But it's looking like in the next month that's going to be overturned. Complicated reasons for that. I think in terms of whether or not you want to call Oregon a success or not, we haven't really had enough time to thoroughly research that. But various geopolitical reasons mean that has now been overturned. The mandatory treatment model currently exists in Costa Rica and Mexico, but only under certain circumstances. So in Mexico, generally, if you're found in possession of any illicit drug for personal use, initially, you'll just be given a voluntary referral to seek treatment. However, if you've come before police for a third time, then you are mandated to then participate in treatment. many people would argue that mandating treatment, whilst technically not within the criminal justice system, is still a very coercive act, and this shouldn't necessarily fall under the umbrella of decriminalisation, but it sometimes is. And so I thought I'd just put that in for completeness. And then finally, of course, we have the dissuasion body model, where there is a drug dissuasion body consisting of a lawyer, a health professional, a social worker. People found in possession of drugs will receive a notice to attend. If they don't attend, they receive a fine. And once they go before this drug dissuasion body, there are a number of options available by the dissuasion body in terms of to find someone, to refer them on, or what occurs in the vast majority of the situations, which is people just have a conversation and then there's no sanction attached. So I've talked about going through those different models, that risk of criminal sanction, and jurisdictions differ widely as to whether or not there's a risk of actually being charged with a criminal offence if you don't comply with, XY condition. In the ACT, it is the case that if you don't comply with the conditions that a criminal offence applies. It is not the case in Portugal. Many of the cannabis fine type schemes, that the decriminalisation schemes, also have this risk of criminal offence if you don't pay the fine. I should note that even if we reformed our laws so that a criminal offence wouldn't apply initially at the outset, there is always a risk because most illicit drugs are in these kind of higher schedules for therapeutic goods, that they might be criminalised under separate regimes, which raises kind of further issues for law reform. All right, so that was a quick overview of different decriminalisation models. What I really think is important that people get out of this is that when we talk about decriminalisation, we're talking about so many different things. And in conversations with others and in terms of, what are we actually calling for, it's much more appropriate and consistent to articulate which type of model you think would be in the public interest and would best meet the needs of people, whether your biggest concern is to do with people who have substance use issues or dependence and what would best meet those needs, or just the needs of society more broadly. It makes more sense to talk in this model-specific language rather than just decriminalisation. Speaking in terms of this model-specific language is also really important, I think, from an advocacy perspective, because the public are going to differ in the kind of decriminalisation model that they want in place. This is the latest household survey, so National Drug Household Survey. And the good news there is that the majority of the population do seem to support decriminalisation of drugs in some way. But you'll notice a huge difference there between the type of drug and what they think the most appropriate response is. So a clear majority of people think that cannabis should be dealt with in terms of a warning or no action. So that would be under a no sanctions model. However, for other illicit drugs, most people think that there should be some formal referral mechanism into a treatment or education program. And so that's moving into more of either the civil and administrative sanction with referral approach, or a Portugal-style drug dissuasion body type approach. I think that is probably more in line with where the public are at in terms of decriminalisation. I should note as well that in terms of evidence, research on the decriminalisation of drugs is fairly skewed towards particular countries. In fact, Sheem, I'm probably mispronouncing this name, but Sheem has done a systematic review on different impact evaluations for drug decriminalisation and legalisation models. And it was really interesting to read the current state of the evidence. So this systematic review wasn't limited by language or anything like that. And the vast majority of impact evaluations are actually based in the United States, and they're focused on the decriminalisation or legalisation of cannabis, which would either support a no sanction or sanction by itself with no referral model, because that tends to be what's implemented in the US. In regards to all illicit drugs, and I think most people would be aware of this, the vast majority of the research is about Portugal. And a lot of the net benefits that we talk about with drug decriminalisation, whether it's decreased levels of overdose deaths, whether it's greater uptake of harm reduction services, whether it's lower levels of bloodborne virus transmission, a lot of those statistics that we talk about with decriminalisation, we're focusing on Portugal and the success of Portugal, which is only one type of model of decriminalisation. Saying that doesn't mean that we should only recommend something just because it has the most research backing it. In fact, there might be an argument that, and there are very good arguments, that Portugal doesn't go far enough. And in fact, we can have even more benefit if we don't attach some of those features of the Portugal model, such as the risk of fines or the use of police issuing those notices or things like that. I think that's a really fruitful discussion, but it reemphasizes to me this importance of model-specific language and why we need to use that language, because we might be talking past each other about what we're actually talking about. All right, so I'll just quickly, because I'm quite wary of time here, because I want to answer some questions. I'll just quickly talk about legalization as well, and how there are different models of legalization. So the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation is the thing that I think is often confused. Decriminalisation is focused on removing criminal penalties for possession and use, and under some definitions, also cultivation. Legalisation, we're talking about some degree of regulated supply of drugs. So people are able to get the drugs. It involves the removal of or modification of laws focused on drug cultivation, manufacture, and supply, as well as possession and use. None of the current regimes that are in place in terms of legalization, say, for example, cannabis legalization is largely what we're talking about, have modified laws to do with import or export, which is a bit interesting. So generally, it has focused on kind of local supply, manufacture, cultivation laws. So as I said, vast majority of discussions about drug legalization at this stage are about the legalization of recreational cannabis, although there are proposals for the legalization of other drugs. So cannabis is currently fully or partially legalized in 10 countries. So that another kind of asterisk attached to that, different lists will tell you a different number of countries have legalized cannabis. Some lists will list countries as legalized, where I would say they're more decriminalized. There are kind of interesting models like in Thailand, where there's legalization, but they're trying to make it more of a kind of medicinal health approach, but then they're likely to reform those laws back. So any kind of too ambiguous laws I'm not counting here. And of course, some jurisdictions like the United States have great variety in terms of the legal status of cannabis between states. So models of legalization differ from kind of homegrown models, which is what we've currently got in the ACT, pharmacy supply and retail models. And then I've also got that some jurisdictions have this strange, ambiguous or unregulated relationship to cannabis. So in Mexico, there was a Supreme Court decision which said that basically there was a need to legalize recreational supply of cannabis. However, the Congress in Mexico has not changed any of those laws. So you've kind of got a situation where the court has said, this is the case, but the laws are still on the books, and from my understanding are still being enforced as if they still apply, even though they're likely to be subject to a court challenge. So it's kind of strange things happening overseas. But in terms of those main models, homegrown model is something that wasn't a really commonly suggested model until relatively recently, and now is coming up more and more. So under a homegrown model, criminal laws against importation and exportation, as well as supply, remain on the books. However, the criminal laws to do with cultivation of cannabis in certain circumstances are removed. So in Uruguay and Malta, there's an interesting approach to this in that they allow cannabis social clubs, registered cannabis social clubs, to cultivate a commercial supply of cannabis and to then sell to members. So you can see that they've legalized supply, but in a very kind of limited sense of you have to be part of these cannabis social clubs, and then you can get your supply there, and you can also grow at home under those regimes. In the ACT and Luxembourg, it's much more limited. There are a certain amount of plants that you can grow per household for personal use. The ACT is odd in many respects. There's limits of plants per household, but because the supply laws are still on the books, how you're getting the seeds or seedlings is technically still a criminalized act. So, you're able to grow it. So cultivation is fine, but how you've gotten to the point where you're growing is a criminal act. And there's further issues with the ACT, of course, because it is a territory, and inconsistencies between federal and territory laws raise a whole bunch of issues associated with that. Pharmacy supply models is exactly what it sounds like. Currently occurs in Uruguay, where they can supply cannabis via a pharmacy. The kind of pro position on this is that a pharmacy allows, qualified medical experts to provide advice on cannabis as they're supplying it to people, so that people really understand the risks associated with cannabis. I have seen some criticism of this policy approach from pharmacists, kind of noting the fact that this is maybe blurring the line between recreational use and therapeutic use of cannabis, and that is quite unhelpful. Retail models are the kind of cannabis supply model, legalization model, I should say, that we see in the United States. So this is where cannabis supply is treated very much in the same way as tobacco or alcohol, where licensed businesses sell cannabis as well as cannabis-related products. And there are regulations attached to who can purchase it, the quality, the packaging, advertising, etc. This retail model has led to some quite significant innovations or commercializations, depending how critical you are of these, of cannabis supply. So we now see in North America things like these THC-infused edibles. We see concentrates or dabs being a thing as well. Some of the more critical perspectives of these retail models are that they have incentivized a really kind of high potency product, and then that's causing some ongoing issues. So similar to decriminalisation, when we're talking about legalization, even just talking about cannabis legalization, we could be talking about a variety of things. What do the public want? Well, it's actually quite unclear. So we do know that, as of this year, more people support cannabis legalization in Australia than oppose it. It is still kind of, minority positions. Certainly for other drugs, there's slight changes, but that's not got much public support. And I think there's an interesting question to be asked here about what model do people have in their head when they think of cannabis legalization? Are they thinking of the American retail model, or are they thinking of the ACT homegrown model when they're answering these questions? And I think, again, model specific language would be important here. When we're talking about evidence for models as well, again, that the importance of that distinction is really, really important. So Farrelly has done a systematic review of impact evaluations, similar kind of approach as the decriminalisation one that I noted. And the vast majority of impact evaluations have been in the United States, which is not that surprising, focusing on these retail models. And the reality is that there's been some fairly mixed findings in terms of cannabis legalization in the United States. So in terms of overall lifetime usage, that tends to go up in terms of cannabis. Recent usage under some studies indicates that recent usage hasn't gone up dramatically. Other studies indicated it has. In terms of teenage usage, that hasn't gone up. but kind of young adults from like 18 to 25. Those usage statistics have gone up. Lots of mixed research about burdens on emergency room departments and the potential role of cannabis in traffic accidents. The basic overall picture of the data currently is mixed in terms of cannabis legalization in the United States. And I want to kind of raise the question as to whether or not that's slightly directed because of this retail model and some of those commercialization offshoots that have come because of that. And maybe we can learn something a little bit more nuanced from that. So our understanding of legalization in other jurisdictions is much more limited, and Farrelly found less than 2% of published papers focused on the Uruguay model, and we don't have anywhere near of the kind of negative outcomes. In fact, they found really no change in usage in those pharmacy and homegrown models. I noted that some people have suggested legalization for other drugs, or there are some things in place. So prescription supply models where you have to go to a doctor and then get a prescription in order to access an illicit drug. I mean, that's currently the case for heroin-assisted therapy, where that has been implemented. The legal status of psilocybin is interesting. There are many jurisdictions across the world where they just don't have that as a criminalized drug, and so that's kind of an unregulated market. Oregon, as part of its law reforms, which who knows if they're going to stay, has a bit of an odd thing where you can access psilocybin from these specialist centers, but it doesn't necessarily have to be supplied for a medicinal purpose. So arguably, there's a kind of psilocybin recreational market in Oregon in the United States as well. All right, so if I can just kind of sum up the main thing that I wanted to emphasize in this webinar, it's that we need to be specific with language, that decriminalization and legalization, well, decriminalization in particular has been the thing that many people who work in the AOD space have been calling for and have noted that there's evidence for, and that is something that Australia should pursue. But I think we need to be more specific about the type of decriminalization model that we're actually calling for, and to note some of those differences, because there's probably going to be differences in different stakeholders involved in drug liberalization efforts that are really important to be articulated and to be discussed. So for both decriminalization and legalization, I think a shift in language is definitely required so that we understand both the evidence and what we're all calling for. And on that point, I'll go to questions.
Thanks so much, Jarryd. That was great. We've got a lot of questions, so let's dive straight in. First up, a lot of people are wondering if decriminalization actually leads to an increase in drug use or drug use harms.
So it will depend on the study, and I can really only kind of tell you the conclusions of those kind of systematic reviews, and they have flaws because there's skewed research on different models and things like that. Overall, the research does show both decriminalization and legalization seem to be correlated with an increase in lifetime usage for some drugs. So people try it, basically. In terms of decriminalization, recent usage doesn't increase, and so that indicates people may have experimented with it, but in terms of regular users, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that decriminalization leads to more regular use by people. Legalization, it depends on the study. Some states in the United States that have legalized have seen upticks in recent usage, others have seen decreases, and when there has been upticks, it has been that kind of young adult group, that kind of 18 to 25. Yeah. I mean, in terms of health harms, I mean, the success of Portugal is really focusing on, I mean, by all measures of drug-related harm, Portugal was a success story in decreasing those harms. I have heard some criticism that we often focus too much on Portugal with the law reform and not on the funding of harm reduction services and all these other things that occurred at the same time. And I think that's a fair criticism, but in terms of decreasing drug-related harms, certainly the evidence does support decriminalisation.
And in terms of decriminalisation, how long does it take to actually know if it's worked? Is Portugal kind of the oldest model that's around, or have there been ones that have existed for much longer?
Certainly, there has been. So there are some jurisdictions that have just never had criminal laws against possession and use. But of course, you can't evaluate that because there's no kind of before and after. I mean, Portugal's 2001. So yeah, so good 20 odd years of how this all works, and that's probably the best kinds of research that we're going to have. There are jurisdictions that have had some degree of decriminalisation for some time, but there isn't a lot of research on them. And I think that that's a bit of an odd thing when you look at the literature. Certainly, there's this skew in the literature of a lot of research happening in the United States, not a lot of research happening in Europe, even though there are decriminalisation efforts in Europe. And then even that, it's mainly just Portugal. And so, yeah, hard to know what the appropriate time frame is.
Yeah, and also sounds like maybe you and I need to move over to Europe and set up a research centre.
Well, yeah, it's strange to me that they're not doing some of those evaluations. I know in some jurisdictions like Germany, for example, because initial decriminalisation occurred via a court decision, there was lag between the court decision and things coming into practice and things like that, and that probably makes evaluation difficult. I don't know if there are any European researchers here who can provide some context. That'd be really helpful.
Great. So if different states and territories have different laws, is there an
Sorry,
easy
just give me 2 seconds. Oh. Okay, now I can hear you.
You were just trying to avoid my question. I know. No, my question is, if different states and territories have different laws, is there an easy way for people to track what's actually happening in their state or territory?
Yeah, I think that's tricky to answer, because from my perspective, I would just, from a lawyer's perspective, I would say, well, look at the, local, Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Act or something like that, and see if those changes are. Things are happening so rapidly at the moment. You really just need to keep updated in terms of news cycles. So in terms of criminal offences themselves, they will generally be under separate acts specifically designed for illicit drug use. So there's Drug Misuse Act, Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Act, those sorts of legislation in each state and territory that you need to monitor.
Okay. And possibly be educated as a lawyer in, or are they fairly easy to read?
I mean, if people want to, hire me to consult for them, I'm not going to turn them down for that.
There was just one thing I kind of wanted to ask around the decriminalisation models, because you sort of touched on it with the legalisation ones, but with decriminalisation, does it mean that the source of the drugs is still illegal, and that black market, like there's no legitimate way to source drugs under any of the decriminalisation models?
That's correct. So, so when we talk about decriminalisation, we're talking about either the removal or modification of laws applying to possession and or use of illicit drugs, supply, trafficking, import, export, all of that remains on the books.
Right. Okay. And you kind of touched on it briefly, but do you know of any research that is around First Nations experiences with those sort of decriminalisation models? Are there any actual models that have consulted with or taken into account First Nations perspectives in any way?
In terms of, impact evaluations that have drilled into particular demographics, I'm not aware of any. I'd be interested in reading them. I do know that in terms of public position statements in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups are very much calling for a no sanction approach, what I would call a no sanction model of decriminalisation. And I think that there's good reasons to advocate for that perspective to some extent. A Portugal model, because it still relies on the police, issues of over-policing, ongoing issues of misuse of discretion and things like that are still potentially at play. And so I think that those concerns are completely valid, and I think that's why certain groups are definitely going to call for a no sanctions approach as opposed to a Portugal approach.
Yeah. In terms of the impact of sort of decriminalisation and legalisation, do you think it is makes it easier for people who are maybe experiencing issues with drugs to seek help?
In terms of treatment uptake, again, I'm defaulting to Portugal, but we know that I feel like stigma is sometimes an overused term without being kind of deliberate about what we're talking about here. But that stigmatization effect of criminalization is a major barrier, if not the major barrier, for people seeking alcohol and other drug treatment. And so the removal of that through law reform is very much been shown to increase people seeking help when they need it. That's one of the main successes of Portugal, I would say, is showing how that destigmatization leads to better outcomes.
And is there kind of a flow-on effect to sort of the treatment services, and like what kind of impact does that then have on the healthcare system? Or does the healthcare system also need to be sort of jointly supported at the same time?
Interesting question. Don't know the answer to that. But that would be, from an advocacy perspective, we always talk about the kind of unequal distribution of funds to do with the national drug strategy and all that sort of stuff. That decrease in spending in law enforcement and reallocating it to health. I can just envision a really good paper or advocacy that could be in place in terms of cost savings. I'm not aware of that research. It may exist. I'm just not aware of it.
Yeah. I guess, there isn't a lot of research in decriminalisation is what we keep coming back to. So
no, it's surprisingly fewer like impact evaluations than I would have expected, to be honest.
Yeah. We have a kind of specific question around cannabis, if that's okay. So it comes in from states where cannabis is legal to be used in that state. But then if you are driving or you get pulled up and you do a random breath test, can you still be charged if cannabis is detected?
Yes. So I think that's an important thing to note as well. Cannabis decriminalisation doesn't necessarily have any impact to do with laws against drug driving, is what people would talk about. So the current situation, and it may change in Victoria, I think, soon, but the current situation in all states and territories is if you are driving with a detectable amount of a prescribed substance like cannabis, then you can be charged with an offence. And that offence sits separately to anything to do with possession and use. So the fact that it's decriminalized or that cultivation is legalized in the ACT doesn't change the fact to do with driving and having a detectable amount in your system. You can still be charged, whether you're in the territory or outside of it.
Okay, that makes sense. But I guess that also does add a lot more complexity to the situation.
Well, and it also, raises an important point about whether or not, when we're calling for decriminalization, whether or not we should be also calling for changes to our drug driving laws. I think that's an important discussion.
Has there been any correlation sort of studies done between decriminalization and rates of crime at all?
As far as I'm aware, so I'm not aware of any kind of, published paper that's looked at it. Might be wrong. But I've read summaries of kind of crime data in jurisdictions that have decriminalized, and there hasn't been any increase in crime. That tends to be the headline, that there has had no impact on the rates of criminal offending in the local area. An exception exists, and this is a confusing thing to do with cannabis legalization, which is I am aware of the fact that in jurisdictions in the United States that have legalized cannabis, if they have jurisdictions around there that cannabis is still criminalized, there is a flow-on effect that there is greater supply of cannabis into that area, and that increases the rates of trafficking issues. To do with cannabis areas. And I think we're going to have a similar issue if we ever in Australia have cannabis legalization in one state but not in another.
Yeah.
It makes sense that if you have supply in one state, that's going to increase flows into the other state. That just makes sense to me.
Yeah. Sort of on that supply, so does decriminalisation and legalisation improve the quality of the drugs? Obviously, we just touched on the fact that the drug supply under decriminalisation is still the black market.
Yeah.
But, is there motivation perhaps for that supply to be better?
This is the biggest argument for legalization over decriminalization,
Okay.
is that legalization is because you can regulate the supply and the manufacture and the cultivation, that you can have greater controls over what is supplied. In terms of decriminalization, not aware of any research talking about the quality of drugs. There is some interesting research about use of pill testing or drug checking facilities and how the use of them can have flow-on effects where people go back to their dealer and say, well, you gave me, crappy stuff, and that has a kind of flow-on effect to improve quality of drug supply. And in a decriminalized regime, you'd probably have more people willing to go to those services, which might have that flow-on effect. But nothing in terms of published research comes to mind.
Okay, we've got probably time for 2 more questions, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned your article that it's often history, not harms, that have led to laws. Mm-hmm. What degree do you think that public perceptions of specific drugs influence or determined policy outcomes in the decriminalisation, legalisation efforts? So, you and I have spoken quite a bit about there's often extensive media coverage around psychedelics or the stigma associated with methamphetamine.
Yeah.
What kind of impact do you think that has on the sort of drug policies?
I think we've seen that really clearly in that the National Drug Household Survey to do with those different perspectives on decriminalization. I think that's the clearest thing. So methamphetamine and heroin, vast majority of people wanted a health or education referral, and hardly ever any were focused on kind of the no sanction approach, as opposed to cannabis, which I think these days is such, it's a normalized drug, I would probably call, compared to these more stigmatized drugs, and people are much more comfortable with a no sanction approach. And so, I think decriminalization, as much as most people I think do support it, I think people do think about risk a lot. And certain drugs and how they're framed definitely heighten people's fear of risk, and that has flow-on effects. And that's certainly also why when we talk about legalization, we only talk about cannabis, because legalization of any other drug, I think, is going to be too unnerving for the general public at this stage because of how things are framed.
Yeah. And do you think that clearer sort of evidence-based education around drugs would help in reducing or impacting those perceptions?
It would be great. The mass media obsession with reporting sensationalist stories on drugs, I don't think is going to go away. And I don't know if a separate education campaign is going to, counter that successfully. I try to do my best and kind of go and speak in, some of the not so great media platforms to try and get that different position across. But I don't know. It's going to be tricky. Things have changed really, really rapidly in many respects, but also really slow. It's public perceptions of things is very I don't know, very shaped by current events, I think.
Yeah, for sure. All right, one last question, and then I promise I'll stop. But this one is kind of intriguing. Do you think that medicinal cannabis prescriptions are sort of a backdoor to legalization?
I wouldn't frame it that way, but we do know, yes, that jurisdictions which have legalized medicinal cannabis are far, far more likely to legalize recreational cannabis. And in a similar way, jurisdictions that have decriminalized cannabis are more likely to legalize. And I think that makes a lot of sense. That if at first decriminalization or any change to our drug laws raises that fear of risk or change or potentially antisocial behavior or things like that, a stepped approach makes a lot more sense. I think, yeah, I also wrote something in the conversation kind of talking about the legalized cannabis party got a significant amount of votes in the last couple of elections. And I was talking about the fact that, yeah, that's great. There's a good kind of active segment of people there. But I think the vast majority of the population is probably going to need decriminalization first,
Okay.
get comfortable, then legalization. And people are slightly resistant to change.
Yes, that's for sure. One question has just snuck in, even though I promised it wouldn't be my last.
So good.
But if Australia does move towards a Portugal model,
Mm-hmm.
would First Nations communities be at a disadvantage? Or would it be a matter of sort of how it was implemented, and were there things that we could do to kind of avert that? And not just probably First Nations communities, but also the sort of LGBTIQ community as well, who's often at a disadvantage.
Yeah, I think there would need to be extensive consultations in how it's implemented. Like the Portugal model, that kind of conversation, I think,
yeah,
from what I understand, is just you have that team and you have that very informal conversation about drug use. I think that environment can be really therapeutic and really productive, and that's one of the reasons the evidence is supporting that. I think one thing to consider is, in terms of First Nations people, making sure that there are representatives from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities on those committees, on those bodies,
yeah,
to have that kind of tailored response. But yeah, I think we're going to, when I say that a lot of the evidence supports the Portugal model, I don't think that would be helpful at all for us to do some sort of wholesale copy paste of a regime over to Australia. There really does need to be some tailoring in terms of our needs.
Yeah, and I think we can safely say that copy and pasting anything, whether it be an educational program or any forms of laws, definitely doesn't work and needs to take into account those sort of much more local contexts.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you so much, Jarryd. I know this is a really complex topic, but thank you for walking us through it and being so willing to answer many questions. There were many other questions, so apologies to anyone who didn't get their question answered. But you can always contact Cracks in the Ice and we can link you in with Jarryd.
I was going to say, feel free to contact me. Yep.
Is very kind and considerate in answering the questions. We are going to wrap this up now. So we're going to be holding more webinars throughout the year. If you'd like to keep up to date, just subscribe to our mailing list via the Cracks in the Ice website. Thank you again to Jarryd, and thank you all to everyone who joined us today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.